what do I play after this? Maple syrup. Hey, it's been a while apparently since I've actually strummed this thing, so maybe I'm just gonna put it down and walk away from it for a second or two, and then maybe I'll practice before next week comes around. But welcome everybody to Maple Syrup. It is the Maple Syrup Show, and we are back. It's a Wednesday. It is a panel of the great people here at the Maple Syrup Show. So every 4 weeks we have a panel, and we invite Fertessa and Jay Bell to come along with us for a ride. And this week we have a special guest. We have Scott Morris here from Lucky Duck Games. And today we're actually talking about what publishers want. And so I hope that all y'all out there in Maple Syrup Land ask questions to Scott and to the rest of the panel about what publishers are looking for when we're talking about pitching games, because we're coming up to convention season, everybody. The world is healing. People are going to conventions. Still wear your masks. Gamma, there have been reports of people who have come back from Gamma with, unfortunately, a little bit of the COVID. In fact, some of our friends who are very safe, Amy, yeah, who just signed in. Amy, I hope you get better soon. It was really sad to hear that you caught COVID, but lots of love out to anybody who did, and hopefully y'all stay safe and you get better soon. So on that note, yes, BJ, it is the J Bell, Sleepy J, as maybe he's known
Yeah.
in certain parts of the world. And hi to Dave Killing, hi to Troy Caban, hi to George, who's writing in from a room somewhere near Cat, I bet. Hi to Jacob Way from from Deepwater, and hi to Amy from Pink Tiger. So lots of people in the chat. If you join us later, please do sign in and let us know that you're here. Questions, concerns from people pitching to publishers, from publishers. Are you a publisher that takes pitches? What are you looking for? Let us know in the chat. So let's get started by, you've heard our origin stories, and if you're a longtime watcher, listener, fan of the show, you've also heard from Fertessa and DJ Bell. But this is literally and oddly the very first time that we've had Scott Morris on. And I say oddly because Scott and I have been friends for a while, and we've known each other for a long time. And he's been in the industry since I've been in the industry, probably even longer. And he's held many positions. And so let's learn a little bit more about the origin of the man, the myth, the legend, Scott Morris.
So thank you for having me be part of this. I think this is awesome. I don't know if I can quite live up to the J Bell. That seems like a really high bar to achieve. So I've been called worse, so I'll take whatever people call me. So it's all good. My origin story. Let's see. So Batman dropped me in Nevada Chemicals when I was 7 years old.
Yes.
No.
That explains the shirt. That explains the shirt.
It does. This is my gauntlet shirt with the Thanos stones on it and everything.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of Roosevelt's, but that's a longer story for a taller drink, as I say. So let's see. I guess I started in the industry in 2013. I thought I retired from a corporate IT tech job and then got pulled into board gaming. Much like everybody else, nobody really goes to college for board gaming. You kind of end up into it somehow. But it is actually really kind of cool. I've actually seen some more colleges are doing like design theory classes and things like that, which is really awesome. I was vice president of Arcane Wonders. I then became president of Passport Game Studios. I then spent the last 6 years running the board game distribution business for GTS Distribution, which is one of the largest distributors in the US and North America. And then last year, Vincent Vergongine, the CEO and founder of Lucky Duck Games, called me and said, "How happy are you?" And I said, "Oh, we're going to have that talk." It turned out to be
make you happier.
Yeah, it was amazing. If anyone who's watching knows Vince, or if you don't, like he's amazing. Like he's just a bundle of joy. He's an awesome person. And I took over as chief sales and marketing officer of Lucky Duck Games in August of last year. So
right. I often describe Vince as a good human.
Yes, amen.
Yeah, he is a good person. He's a good man.
Yeah.
When I think about, how men should be, Vince is often top of mind as that's a good model to follow. If you want to be a good man, follow Vince and see what he does. And he's made mistakes, and but he
Sure.
lives up to them, and he's just a good dude all around. So hats off to Vince, who's also Vince has been on the show. Vince has been on the
Yep.
show. I was gonna say no, he's not, but he has a little while ago. Okay, so in your role as I think you're like what chief officer of marketing and something something
Sure, some
all the
biggity
power in
wig
the world.
title, whatever you wanna call
It's
it.
got letters, guys. It's got lots
It's
of
Chief
letters.
Sales and Marketing Officer, but like I
There you go.
said, I've been called worse, so you can call me whatever you like.
So what is your role? What do you do?
What is it you do here? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I have sales, marketing, and editorial team members all around the world. So Lucky Duck, if anyone's not familiar with us, we do our own publishing and we have our own studio that develops games. We're really known for making things called digital hybrid games. They're games that are tabletop games that will interact with a technical device and kind of augment the experience for you. The biggest one most people know us for is Chronicles of Crime. You might know us for Destinies, Kids Chronicles, things like that. In addition to that, we also do localization for other publishers, and we also act as an agent for other publishers to more broadly localize and distribute their games. My team is very diverse and very widely spread out. I have a sales, marketing, and editorial team in Italy, in Poland, in France, and then a team here in America. There's no editorial people in America, obviously, because most people don't need that kind of service, so it's not that
Mhm.
big of a deal. But I do everything from setting the global sales and marketing strategy down to setting up booths, like I did at Gamma last week. So a little
Right.
bit of everything.
Okay, cool. So let's get this panel started now that we know who we're talking to. And today's topic really is what publishers want. So I'm going to lead off with a question straight to you, Scott, because you're the one representing publishers here.
Sure.
Well, what do you want from
Um,
a game designer?
I want to take long walks on the beach. No,
Do you like
I
pina
hear you.
colada? Do you like
Right?
pina
Yeah.
colada?
Sure. Yeah. Well, yep. So,
You want us to
um,
care about your feelings.
that's right.
Yes.
That's right. I'd say
Mhm.
caring is a big part of it, actually.
It is.
Sharing
Um,
also.
so I obviously don't want to speak for every publisher because every publisher is different. Everyone has different needs and desires and what they're looking for and what they're trying to do. We, from a Lucky Duck perspective, and me specifically, when I meet with designers and what I'm looking for, I generally don't care about the game. I mean, it's important. Obviously, we want it to be a good game and we want it to be something fun and something enjoyable. I look more at who the person is first and foremost. I kind of look at what's their track record, what have they done, or what are they aspiring to do. When it's a first time designer, may not have a track record to lean back on, although some of them do. There's many designers that we meet that have things that have been published, like through the GameCrafter.com or something like that, that they've done on their own. And that's a great way to kind of learn more about what their design philosophy is and strategies and things like that. But I want to get to know the person more. We talked briefly before we got on the air about Ammon Anderson. Yeah, I met him at Gamma last week. Hi, Ammon, if you're out there, hello. He's probably freaking out now that we mentioned his name. um,
Ah.
he he has a wonderful game that he's pitching to several different publishers right now. And when we met, I knew the game was good immediately once we started playing it. But then I got to know him, and I was like, very much like what you said about Vince being such a good human. I was like, man, this is just a good dude. Like, he's just a good person, and I want to work with people that are good people. Like, that's like the first and foremost thing for me. So who you are as a person is a really big thing for me. When it comes to the actual game and like looking at the actual mechanics and the thematics and all the different things that you've put into it from a designer, my keyword is unique. Like, that's one of the biggest things. I think all too often people throw around the word innovative in this industry, and people try to like strive for this Mount Everest peak of something that's almost unattainable sometimes. And I think sometimes the really more important thing is to not try and like break the mold and remake something completely brand new and fresh. If you can, that's great. But just having something that's different and unique in the marketplace that you don't compare things to, right?
Mhm.
My personal pet peeve is when someone sits down and goes, "So this is kind of like something like Endeavor and Seven Wonders had a baby," and I'm like, "Okay, cool. Why don't I go play Seven Wonders or Endeavor?" Like,
Like back to back.
right, yeah, exactly. So unique is a very big thing, and the quality of the person is a very big thing as well.
I love that. I love both of those things that you're talking about. To tell you all just a little story about how Jay and I broke into the business is we decided straight from the start to be very professional, to be people who, if you wanted something done, we would hit those deadlines. If you wanted to communicate, we would communicate with you. You know, all those things that mean that this is a person who you want to work with, because we knew that not every game that we designed would hit with everybody, but we knew that we could hit with everybody. If you
Mm,
get if you get what I'm getting at, right? And so we worked really hard at, like, it's not curating an image per se or a brand, but we did work hard on being the best people we could be, both online and offline. And when we had meetings and making those meetings and communicating and, not wasting people's time.
mm,
I often say wasting people's time is like the cardinal sin of pitching.
Sure.
Uh, and I think it's served us in good stead. We've had a long and storied career. I have over 50 published things. And it's because I think, in part, that we are very professional in how we
Mhm.
treat the industry and how we treat our partners. Like, we view our publishers as our partners, people who we're in this together with, right? So hopefully that kind of thing where you say you're looking at the person. Is this a
Yep.
person who you want to work with long term? Because for those of you who haven't got a game sign yet, it can be years. It can be years, just to get the game out. And then you could have a very long lifespan with that game, and you have to be tied to that publisher for many years, and they have to be tied to you. And if there's bad blood, it's not going to be great. It's going to be, there's going to be animosity. And who needs that? Nobody has time for that. Right. So the better that you can be, or at least professional, I think that's a really good point. And then the other thing about unique and innovation, I think innovation is a big trap. Like, I always say that to people.
Yep.
Innovation is a trap because it's going to lead you to this place where nobody actually understands what you're trying to do. It's like too clever.
mm.
And it might be before its time level of cleverness, where, like, we talk about it 5 years later. Remember that game that went nowhere? Now everybody's making stuff like that,
Yeah.
but
Right.
you might have been too innovative. And oftentimes, one little bit of innovation is great, but too much is, like, overwhelming for people. So I think I'm
Sure.
I'm on the same wavelength as you. What do you think, Jay?
Yeah, I definitely think I agree. As you were talking about just kind of not crafting an image, but trying to present your best self in
Yeah.
everything that you kind of every interaction that you have. It's kind of odd because like I remember coming into the industry and I didn't really realize just how small of an industry it was
It's tiny.
and how much like relationships really mattered. But
Hmm.
quickly did find that out after I went to like my first convention, like started to meet tons and tons and tons and tons of people. And the relationship really made a difference more than anything. And it's funny we talk about innovation and how it can be not really overrated, but not as important as you might think. And the first game I actually thought of when you said that, Scott, was my shelfie. Like it's not, I wouldn't personally call it like an innovative, different thing, but it taps into something that's recognizable and still different enough to stand out. And
Mhm.
that's probably why it connected with me so much. I mean, I played the game too much on VGA, but um, yeah,
Nice.
it's I don't know, it's really like there's like a secret, not a secret sauce, but it's just something done right without thinking about it too hard.
Mhm.
It's like a new take on a familiar thing rather than a completely unfamiliar, innovative. Like, innovation doesn't need to be something I've never seen before. It can just be a take on something that I've seen before in a new way.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing that people get stuck on. They're like, oh, it has to be completely like brand new and nothing, and no one should ever recognize any part of it for it. No, you could just do a normal thing, but just slightly differently.
Yeah, I think because games, especially analog games in and of themselves, have this barrier to entry of rules, this whole rules thing. The more innovative you have the game, the less hooks you have to, hang a hat on. and the more you actually have to rely on the rules teaching the game as opposed to, oh, I've seen kind of things like this before. I understand how this kind of works. We have a question from George, and I'm going to pose this to Fertessa. Fertessa, speaking of presenting your best self, and I love the way you phrase that, Jay, and I think of like authenticity. Is there anything that you can do before you even open your mouth to set a good or maybe a bad tone? What wouldn't you do for an interaction? So, for Tessa, is there something that you do to set yourself up for success?
Sure. You should absolutely be doing prep work before you meet publishers or kind of introduce yourself to new people when you're networking. If you're meeting specific publishers, always do the groundwork as to like what their lines are like, what might be interesting to them. Do you know if they're like taking pitches? I don't know what context you would be meeting the publisher, but it's always good to kind of bone up on these different facts. And then also for yourself, let's say you don't know who you're going to run into, you're just going to be at a convention. It's always great to prepare a 60-second elevator pitch. Like you're stuck in an elevator with somebody and you need to introduce either yourself or your games. So have a elevator pitch for yourself, but also if there are games that you are pitching and you just happen to get in a spot where somebody's like, oh, tell me about the game, figure out how to condense it into 60 seconds, because the thing that's really crucial is time. And like was mentioned, you don't want to waste anybody's time. So if you're able to like concisely describe what you're bringing to the table, that can be enough to interest somebody to ask further questions. You don't have to answer all of those questions in your first like introduction of yourself in your game. So
Yeah,
that's the prep work that I
that's a great
Absolutely.
point. Yeah, you don't have to answer everything in your spiel. Let people
Mm.
ask questions.
Yes.
That's
In
actually
fact, don't.
engaging,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. This is a really good question. And Jessica Anders asks if a hybrid game, you know, of two things that exist and hybridizing them together isn't a big pull, but also balancing it to be not too much out there. What kind of language do you recommend, Scott, for describing the game?
Sure. First, I love every single syllable that Fertessa just said.
Yeah,
Like everything you said is perfect on that. I agree 1000% with that.
no
Um,
notes.
in terms of the language, I would actually focus it more not on this is like A or B, but what is the experience that your game is going to give someone? And not saying this is going to be an experience like Seven Wonders, or not
Mm.
saying this is a drafting experience. This is actually one of my big kind of personal pet peeves and hangups. I tell everyone at Lucky Duck Games, we don't make board games. Absolutely hard stop, end of discussion. We don't make board games. And that usually freaks people out when I say that because they're like,
Oh,
you're
yes,
a
we do.
board game publisher. Like, what are you talking about? My entire philosophy is we make memories. And everything we do, putting our love and putting our efforts into those games, results in them making a memory for people at their table. From the moment they open the box to playing the game to putting it back on their shelf and wanting to play it again, we want those to be positive memories. I'm like hyper obsessed with that, like almost probably to a unhealthy degree at some point. So, but I think that knowing the kind of experience you want your game to invoke at the table is a really good thing. One of the biggest challenges for me personally when I was designing Firefly Shiny Dice with Upper Deck was my son and I had a very specific expectation of what we thought people would use the components and how they would do things with the game. And as a designers, we all know like one of the most like gut wrenching things is when you like put a game in front of someone with rules and do blind play testing for the first time, and they like completely do everything opposite of what your intent was. And you're like, what's wrong with you? It's like playing a game of Mysterium. You're like, what's wrong with you? This is clearly the answer, and you're not doing it right. You know, it's like, but it teaches you so much about it and everything. And I think that knowing what you want that experience to be helps you not only from a design perspective, but it helps you greatly when you're making that introduction, or like Fertessa said, when you're making that 60-second, sometimes even shorter, right? Sometimes like 30-second. And it's kind
True.
of funny that you use the term elevator pitch because a lot. I actually had that happen to me at Gamma while we were going up and down to our room in the elevator. Someone actually jumped in and they're like, "You're from Lucky Duck Games." I'm like, "I am. I didn't know that. What are you talking about?" And he's like, "Oh yeah." He's like, I'm actually designing a game." I'm like, "Oh, cool. Let's talk." And we literally had about 5 floors of time to talk with each other, and it worked out great. It was a very
And
quick.
did he manage an actual elevator pitch? Like, did he get it
He
out?
did, yeah. It was a very quick thing, and it was very brief, but it was enough to have me ask him for a card and get back to him.
Oh,
So yeah, it was cool.
Very
well,
funny story. Very, very funny story. It was a year that Jay and I weren't at the same convention. Jay was at SDCC just to be at SDCC, San Diego Comic-Con, not for games, just because he's a comic fan like I am. And he was in the elevator with somebody, and they got talking. And it's like, "Oh, what do you do?" "Oh, I design board games." "Oh, that's interesting. I work for Buffalo Games." And Jay's like, "I happen to have my sell sheets here."
Sure.
So it literally
Nice.
happened not at a game convention, at a nerd
That's awesome.
convention. I mean, let's be honest. But he had his sell sheets because I guess he was a Boy Scout and he's always prepared. And so he was able to pitch John Bell in the elevator at San Diego Comic Con,
That's awesome.
and it actually happened. It was just
That's
so
so
funny that
cool.
these things actually can happen. So yeah, be prepared.
There's an
Have
old
have
phrase
those
that
pitches
you
ready.
there's an old phrase that you keep your tools sharp for when you need them, right?
Yeah,
So
mm,
that's right. So I think, Jessica, the idea of saying comparators, and we honestly, like in Hollywood, we use lots of comps all the time. It's like this is like this show plus this show. It's the Hollywood pitch is what it's called. And it's very, very common, but I find that it gets some very weird reactions in board gaming, possibly because the person you're pitching to might not like that game, or they have opinions about it, or they get the wrong idea about it. And so rather than using comps in board gaming, I think what I usually do is I describe the feelings, I describe what people do in it, in a very like less mechanical way. I try to show more than tell, and I let the other person make the comparison. So I've literally come up to some people, and I will use comps if I know the person very well. Like if I'm talking to Tanya from Hasbro, I've basically said, "Hey, Tanya, Sushi Go plus Scrabble," and she's like, "Yes, show me that game,"
mm,
sure.
right? Because that works for her, and she knows that I can
And
design
that's a
that
good
game,
point
but
to
it's
what
different.
Fertessa mentioned earlier is knowing your audience a little bit,
yes.
right? Being able to do the
Yeah.
homework. One of the most amazing discussions I've had in the board game industry, this was back in 2014 when I was with Arcane Wonders. We went to one of those speed gaming events where it's like speed dating and you get like, 60 seconds with each person. And this young man, he was like maybe 20, maybe 21, like really young, sat down and he looked at my shirt and he said, "Oh, you're with Arcane Wonders." And I said, "Yeah." And he reaches down into his folder and he pulls out, or his backpack, and he pulls out a folder. And I open it up and it was a custom made presentation about why his game is good for Arcane Wonders. And it talked about like, this is what I perceive Arcane Wonders to be as a company, who your brand is, what kind of games you make, why does my game align with that or augment that.
Wow.
And I didn't even look at the game, and I just looked at him. I went, "Yeah, we need to talk." I
Yeah.
was like, that was like super impressive to put in that level of homework ahead of time and everything. So,
Mhm.
Mm,
yeah, knowing your audience is very important because yeah, you don't want to sit down and say this is like X, and that person, like you said, and Jay mentioned this earlier, this industry is so small. There is a very good chance that that person may or may not like that game, or may not have some type of history with the game. So
Yeah.
it's best to not compare yourself, right? Like I would never tell anybody I'm as cool as Senfung, but I don't look as good, right? Like I'm not going to say that to anybody.
He looks better, but he isn't as cool.
No, you have more hair than I do.
a lot
Hair's
of
not
my
everything.
a lot of my background is in sales, and I've always been told never reference the competition in any way. The
Sure.
reason being that you're either saying I'm not as good as them, in which case what are you doing, or you're
Mhm.
saying I'm better than them, in which case what are you doing?
Yeah.
Because neither of those is something that you should be doing. You should be saying, don't think about them,
Yep.
me. This is
Yeah.
what I'm here for. And so that's why my main question when I'm playtesting is not what did you think of this mechanic or any of that stuff. It's if you're telling someone about this game tomorrow, what are you going to tell them? And then
Yep.
what I get from that is a whole bunch of information about what kind of person this is. Because if they start talking about mechanics, okay, I understand that they're going to be looking at the technical side. If they start talking about the experience, then I can compare that to what I think my gamers like to play. And if they start talking about the theme, then I know whether they're in my audience. And also all of those things together tells me who they are and whether I'm actually talking about my game correctly. I use all of that information in my pitch.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted
So,
to
yeah, go ahead.
just to slightly add to that, whenever you depend on kind of using a description like this game but meets this game, you're also kind of weakening your position because you are depending on someone else's prior knowledge
Yeah.
to understand your game,
Yep.
and making that assumption uh, is just bad all around. You don't know what someone else has played that can easily like trip up your pitch if you can then not describe how your game is because you can only
Sure.
relate it to other games.
That
And
is a very,
um,
very good
Yeah.
point.
I actually just had
So,
that experience last week when we were at Gamma, and there was a retailer that came to our booth, and we had a game that's coming out later this year called Senjutsu on the table. And I said to him, I said, "Are you familiar with Unmatched?" And he goes, "I mean, I know the game, but I don't know anything about it." I'm like, "Okay, just throw that discussion out the window, right?" Like,
yeah.
and I realized when I did that, like I was breaking one of my own cardinal rules. So it was like, yeah,
Yeah, and it is one of those things like when I say don't waste people's time, another cardinal sin is making people feel stupid.
Yeah.
yep,
And if they're supposed to know the best game in the world and they don't, and they're in the industry, you
sure,
might have just insulted them like a backhanded kind of insult.
sure.
Yeah.
Hey, J Bell, I wanted to ask you because you're a graphic designer by trade.
Yeah.
Um, how do you do your presentations, like sell sheets, pitch decks,
Mm.
whatever? Because that's kind of your field of expertise. Do you do that? Do you put a lot of
Wow.
time and effort into that kind of stuff?
I do put time and effort into it because I found out that it's really helpful. I came into the industry during the pandemic and like the height of it. So pitches were online, super heavy online. I did the Winter Nun Pub feedback frenzy.
Mhm.
And from like the research that I did, people were using like tabletop simulator or like physical prototypes and like hold it up to the screen. And I thought, I'm just gonna do like some really nice Google slides because I can make the slide look exactly how I want and use like screen clippings from PTS and Photoshop it to make it look great. And I realized that using those skills to paint a visual, whether you have like, $5 art, $1 million art, or art from your younger sister, that doesn't really make a difference if it's presented in a way that still tells people what the game is about. So yeah, that'd be my biggest advice as far as graphic design. Don't focus on the art per se or how pretty it is or how captivating it is. Just make sure it gets the point across and tells your story in the way that matters. And same for sell sheets in person. Like when I was at the big Unpub event in March, I told a couple guys, look, you gave me a huge block of text. I'm a visual learner. I just need to see the pictures. Give me bullet points. Like show off the game. Don't tell me words. Show off the game.
Right. Show don't tell. More of that. We have a question from Edward Taylor King. TK is asking. We are self-publishing our game Galactic Cruise and have been approached by several publishers with their desire to co-publish, which is more and more a common thing these days. It's very interesting, like seeing a decade ago how it's changed to like, hey, we'll help pick up part of that tab. And, I think Lucky Duck has even sort of kind of ventured into that sort of co-branding
Mhm.
area, which
Yeah.
is really kind of cool for things like, Flamecraft, which started off as Cardboard Alchemy and now is more of a Lucky Duck thing. So what's your advice in those situations, Scott? When is co-publishing a good move?
So, like I told my daughter, don't marry for money, marry for a lot of money.
Oh,
No, I'm kidding. So yeah, so we have just recently started doing that as well, and Cardboard Alchemy and Flamecraft is a great example. Despite us doing the global distribution for hobby and distributors for that, it is still very much Cardboard Alchemy's games. We're just kind of a piece of the puzzle to them, so to speak. When it comes to co-publishing, it really is something that you want to ask yourself. If you're publishing your own game and you're doing it through Kickstarter or GameFound or any other crowdfunding kind of platform, you want to look at what the long-term plan is. So is it something that you want to start to develop distribution partnerships for? And do you want to actually manage those distribution partnerships? Because I'll give you a hint, they're not easy. But then there's also other pieces to this puzzle. And I look, and just specifically talking about the North American market, I look at the market, quote unquote, as a multi-piece puzzle. You've got direct to consumer, which could be either on your website or through crowdfunding. You've got direct to retailers, which is you publishing your game and then selling it directly to retailers, which is also very challenging and very time consuming as well. And also something that is relationship focused.
Yeah, B2B is
You've
hard.
got, you get the distribution piece, which is really just a piece. And it's really funny. I had this conversation at Gamma last week where somebody was so excited. They were like, yeah, I got picked up by this major distributor. And they're like, I'm done. I'm like, no, you're not. Like, you're just beginning.
Sweet summer
Like,
child.
it's not the final end game, right? So
It is a good milestone, though.
it's a great milestone. It's definitely something to be
wonderful.
celebrated.
But you're not done.
But then you also have the online market. You have online retailers like Miniature Market, Game Nerds, TSI, places like that. And then you have Amazon, and then you have mass market. And each one of those are their own individual things. And you probably know this very well, Sam, because a lot of your games are across many different pieces of those market. And some of the games do better in some sections and some of the games do better in other sections, right? And what makes someone buy something on Amazon is not necessarily what makes someone buy something at Target, and not what makes them buy it at their local store. So it's all very different pieces of the market. So in terms of co-publishing, I think the biggest thing is to look for a partner that has the ability to help you get to those different areas. If you are working with a co-publisher who can only get you to one or two of those pieces of the puzzle, might not necessarily be the best solution for you. If it's, but it might also be, it might be something that you look at it and, for example, we're coming out with a game next year called The Dark Quarter, which is a very mature game. That's a game I would never expect to see on a shelf in Target or Barnes and Nobles or anything like that. So that's something that if I had designed that and I was looking for a co-publisher, if they were to come and tell me, we're great in mass market, be like, cool, that's not where my game's going. So let's talk about other things, right? I think it's about aligning what you can do as a publisher and what your co-publisher can do for you and fill in those gaps and make the right business decision as to what's best for you and your game long term. And I would definitely 1000% recommend relationship is everything in that situation. The last thing you want to do is work with a co-publishing partner that you don't have a trusted relationship with. For me, that word is like the key to everything, whether it's designer to publisher, publisher to partner, whatever it may be. It's honestly, it's life, right? Like I trust you, Sen. I've known you for so long that it's like, I trust you. I hope you trust me, but that develops a good partnership and friendship. And that's the way people work. And that's the way businesses work because people run businesses. So it's,
So
I definitely know. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I've got a question off the back of that. I've been speaking to people who are publishers who've talked about producing the game rather than co-publishing the game. Could you explain what the difference between those two is as far as you understand it?
Great question.
I think Scott Gata started that because he
totally
did. He started Renegade. I think he called himself producer, and I was like, "Ooh, aren't you all fancy like producer?" It's like, I think the biggest thing for that is it's someone else's creation, it's someone else's design, and you're helping front it with the money to make it reach a broader audience, right? I always laugh. There was a great movie called The Amateurs with Jeff Bridges, where they're making this movie in this small town and this kind of goofball character comes to him and he's like, do you have just like a role where I can just give you money and just stand around and watch? And they're like, so the next day we made Otis the executive producer, right? It's like,
yeah, that's totally a Scott Gata thing. Other Scott, Scott, Jacob Way says that you covered it very well, that question about co-production. And he's also adding his 2 cents in as Deepwater, saying that a relationship can be parasitic, it can be symbiotic. And so make sure that each side feels like their side has been fairly compensated, right? So
gotta be a partnership.
Yeah, it's got to be a partnership. Negotiation is win-win, right? If
I need to
it's
take
not
2
win-win,
seconds, and I need to
yeah,
give Jacob a big shout out and love because I just
yeah,
saw him last
100%.
week and he's awesome. And I also saw that Helena Capella is in the audience. So hey, love you. Endeavor Deep Sea is awesome.
Yeah. Helena was talking and talking about what J Bell was saying, that a prototype with great graphic design is so nice as a publisher. Graphic design, for those of you who are out there and designing, you might get captivated by illustration and art and all that kind of stuff, but really, if you're going to put money into anything, and I don't advise you to actually put money into it, but learn the skills, right? To actually communicate well through your graphic design. That is the key to all the things that Jay was talking about on your sell sheet, on your prototypes, in your slide decks. It's all graphic design. None of it is illustration, right?
I would,
UX.
And
I would
Jay, I
s-
have a question for you.
Oh,
Like, how do you balance not diving too deep into that rabbit hole, right? Because I'm sure you could get lost when you're a good
Oh
graphic
my
designer and
gosh.
you love what you're doing. Suddenly you're like, oh, I just need to do a couple of things, and then boom, I'm like making 3,000 slides for the next 18 hours, right?
Yeah, yeah. I want to make sure we get back to Fertessa, but I'm so glad you asked that question because I wanted to talk about how um I've probably prototyped, I don't know, 10 dozen different games now, but my most recent two, I forced myself to not use anything except for pencil and paper. So my two most recent prototypes have no color, like they're not generated from any Adobe products. And I was so happy that someone at Unplugged in March, they said, this graphic design is great. Like there's no like stuff on it, but it looks like I can tell where everything is. And so I wanted to bring up that point. Like the graphic design doesn't mean, the best clip art after you've searched for 5 hours on Google. It just means making it clear enough for the game to be understandable.
Right.
Takes a lot of trial and error and sort of understanding you can waste too many hours. That's how I don't dive in the rabbit hole. I'm skilled, but like I know that you can spend too much time on the wrong thing.
and Fertessa, you were about to say something.
Yeah, I was just gonna say to Jay's point earlier about sell sheets. Whenever I started out, and I mean even now, I've saw a lot of designers who kind of discounted themselves because they weren't graphic designers, and so they would either want to pay somebody to do sell sheets or their board game design, or they would kind of put something together, and when they got feedback they'd say, well, I'm no graphic designer, this is the best I can do. But I want to say that there are some key things that you can do no matter what level you are at, and it is graphic design is about having a hierarchy in whatever information you're presenting, and so it needs to be clean and clear. So some great rule of thumbs, I'm just going to talk about sell sheets,
Yes.
is you want to use readable fonts. Non-serif fonts are great. And you don't want the futuristic ones where everything looks very curved and like an O. You don't want the very thematic fonts that match your spooky theme. You want your fonts to be very clear. Even if that doesn't feel fun to you, I promise it will be great because they can read it. And then the second thing is colors. You may have this little voice in your head that says, I need to make sure they can see it. So let me just put yellow behind all of this text, or let me just bleed all of the colors behind this. Don't do it. Don't put pictures behind your text. Don't put giant blocks of color unless you have changed the text to match that. But even then, there's usually not a good reason to do that
Please
unless the
no.
font is black, because you want everything to be accessible and you want it to be readable, and it's hard on the eyes if you move away from black font. It just is. So whenever you're making your cell sheets, white space is actually great. It gives the eyes room to breathe and it helps you kind of line up where your stuff is so they know what order to look at things. And
Hierarchy is
that's
so
super
important.
important.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one thing that I think a lot of people don't understand. They hear graphic design and they think, that sounds really scary. I don't know what it means. Okay, so just think about it as making things clear.
Yep.
the experience. Like UX is another thing that people often use. This is a functional piece of work. So what's the function of this piece of work? It is to tell people about your game. So what do you want them to know first? What do you want them to know second? What's important? Illustrate it. All those sorts of things. Like explain it in diagrams, make it really accessible, make it so that a 5-year-old can understand it in a glance.
Yeah.
Like just think about how you can simplify it, and don't just get rid of the words graphic design if they freak you out. Get rid of UX, get rid of all of that stuff, and just think functional. This is a functional piece of work.
Yeah,
exactly.
More show, less tell.
Yes.
And you can apply that, whatever you learn with cell sheets, you can apply that to your actual board games whenever you are prototyping, because that cleanness that Jay was talking about, where you just like hand draw everything, is great. That I also do that because I can sometimes, get crazy on Photoshop and, finding all the icons. But something that's helpful is making these kind of pen and paper prototypes until it gets to the point where I have like 100 cards and I don't want to refill out all of the information 100 times. There was a point where I was drawing like 100 different characters. And that was on me. That's
on you.
I enjoyed that. But at that point, then you might want to say, okay, let's take it to a computer so that we can expedite the process.
Yeah. If it's part of your process, if you are somebody who learns through play and draw and finds that a way to design, more power to you. But you don't have to do it that way, is kind of what I think we're saying. And Jessica Andres is saying that the cell sheet is kind of like a resume for your game by the sounds of it. That's a great way of putting it. I love it. And simple is better. Simple is almost always better, because usually when you're handing it to a publisher, they've been on their feet for 7 to 8 hours in a Gen Con hall with sweaty nerds, and they've been selling the game. Their voice is hoarse. Their eyes are red, and they're like, they need some Visine. And the less effort they have to do to understand your game.
And the lighting's often terrible.
Often.
Yes.
Don't expect people to be able to, if you can like read it in daylight, yeah, good, cool. But like take it to the grottiest pub that's near you or something with terrible light, or your average board game store. Honestly, they don't seem to light things. And see if you can read it when you're tired, when you're distracted, all those sorts of things. I mean, the main thing on a cell sheet, right, is the game, the vital stats, and the hook, right, and some pictures
and contact information. You'd be
and
surprised
contact
how many people
information.
leave that off.
Yes, I would not be surprised because I just forgot to say it.
Very essential things. Yeah, go ahead, Fertessa.
Oh, I was just going to say also, it helps a lot if you show your game in play or people playing your game versus like a static image.
Box shot, yeah. I don't want a box shot. I want to see what is happening.
Yeah.
And I would love like annotation on your pictures, like say, hey, at point 1, this is what this person is doing. Great. Explain your game through pictures with a few annotated, captions. We're golden. We're really good there. And Troy, you're right. Oftentimes publishers are also sweaty nerds. Unless you're Helena. Helena is not a sweaty nerd. I can vouch for Helena. She is not a sweaty nerd.
Helena doesn't sweat. She perspires.
She glows.
That's right.
Magically glows. What else are you looking for, Scott? I know we've talked about unique. We've talked about the pitch. We've talked about the elevators.
I just mentioned hook. Do we want to describe what a hook is for people who don't know?
Sure.
Okay, Scott, what's a hook to you?
It's what you catch fish with.
No. It is though. It is though.
It is. It is. Kinda, right?
The hook is the one thing, the thing that will get a publisher, myself or anybody else, on the line where you say one statement that is either shocking or surprising or exciting, could be any different type of emotion, but it's the one thing that you believe will sell your game, right?
Yeah. So we were just talking about Gnome Hollow before. What's the hook?
Oh, Ammon.
Isn't it?
Okay,
really,
that's very nice.
Is a big part of the hook.
No, I mean, I say that jokingly. He is a big part of that. I think the big thing for me when I sat down to play Gnome Hollow was there's these magnetic boards, and in terms of prototypes, like Ammon went way past what normal people would do for a prototype. Like he's at like Dr. Reiner Knizia levels of like prototype stuff, which is awesome.
It's got 3D printed gnomes and all.
Yeah, it was amazing, the signs and like everything. But it was the feeling that when I sat down, I remember it wasn't actually Ammon. It was someone else that was sitting at the table. I can't remember what his name was. I think it was West. He looked at me and he said, "So I don't know if you've played this game before, but we're going to be making circles." And literally from that one statement, I was like, I looked at the board and I'm like, I know everything that's about to happen. Like
Right?
I got it just from the visual cues and what was going on. I didn't know all the rules. I didn't know, when, sell this, move that, change that, but I understood what experience I was about to have with it, right? Which was really,
Yes.
really good. So
I
I
think
will
with
never forget, and he's probably going to be mad at me if I say this, but a certain gentleman we all know and love, Everson Matsauchi, designer of many, many games. I was at Dice Tower East, and before it was Dice Tower East, it was just Dice Tower.
Mhm.
And he said to me, he goes, "Do you care like what prototypes look like?" And I'm like, "No, I don't really care. Like, I mean, if they're pretty, they're pretty, and if they're not, they're not." And he's like, "Excellent." And he reached into his bag and he pulled out a set of diner cards, like the 1950s, like write down your waiter or waitress will write down what's on the card, and there was just numbers. It's all it was just numbers all over the cards. And he starts explaining everything to me, and I'm like, this game's cool. Like I could tell immediately from how he was doing it and what he was talking about. That game went on to be Century Spice Road,
Right.
which
well
did
then.
fairly well, I would say.
Right.
Right? So I think part of that, the hook for me was that was a little bit of enticement where he was like, almost like kind of baiting me with, hey, do you really care what it looks like? Like, does it need to be like all flashy and
Yeah.
fireworks and everything? And I'm like, no. And he's like, great, you're gonna love this, right? And
This is
so,
going to be the worst looking best game you've ever played.
right, exactly.
The challenge.
Exactly.
He laid the smack down. Emerson's
It
awesome
might
that
have
way.
made like Jay twitch a little bit because it was just no graphic design whatsoever, right? So,
Well,
Ah,
you brought up a great point that I wanted to ask about because I get this question a lot when I just chatting with folks on Twitter, like kind of a two-part question. And this isn't a quote, but this is usually how the question is posed. When is a game ready to send to
oh,
a publisher or pitch to a publisher?
I
To
just
like,
answered
and
that
then you look at
today.
like a percentage, like 90%, 95, 99, 82. And then the follow-up question is, how many times should I have play tested my game before pitching it to a publisher? And I'm like, these are probably the two questions I get asked the most that don't
Oh,
really, as far as I know, have answers.
oh man, Jay, if I had the answers to that, I'd be rich. Like,
that like the magic
yeah, that's
questions.
you're
If you can
talking
if
about
you
the
can get
$64
that.
million question right there.
Yeah.
But it's good questions to ask because the reality is there is no one right answer. It's the answer that you as a designer feel comfortable with, right? I've had people pitch me games that came up with them the night before. I've had people pitch me games that have been working on them for 5 years. And I think it's really how comfortable you are with the state of the game, and more so how comfortable you are telling your story from the game. One of my greatest mentors, a woman named Melissa that I used to work with at Dell, she used to tell me, you need to know and tell your story. And that is for everything in life. Doesn't matter if it's your personal life with friends, if it's your professional life as a job or some business that you run, being able to be comfortable sitting down with someone, possibly a stranger that you've never met before, and you have no idea what their likes and dislikes are or what kind of person they are, to be able to sit down and say, this is what my game is, and this is why I think it's good for you, and how we can be successful with it together. That could be 10 prototype play tests. It could be 1,000. It's kind of a hit and miss type thing. I will say that the lower the number, the more challenging it can be, right? I've seen some people bring things to me that it's very clear that it's like, hey, you've got an idea, right? Like you've got a good idea. We need to just like start pushing buttons and pulling levers and stuff like that. And I think, somebody in the chat made a comment about this earlier. I think I can't remember. I'm not sure if I can see it just quickly off the top of my head, but it's a kind of a question of like,
Troy's
how
comment.
much does the publisher want to be involved with
Mhm.
getting the art, getting the graphic design, developing the game? There's some publishers that don't want to look at a game unless it's 100% developed. They want to just find a designer that says, this is done, I'm good, turnkey, and I can publish it. And then there's others that want their fingerprints over everything, where they're like, oh, Fertessa has this great idea, but I'm just going to tweak it this way, and I'm going to turn it this way, and I'm going to put my little like fingerprint on it and everything. And again, there's no one right answer with that. It's really, what you feel comfortable with from a relationship standpoint, and what you feel comfortable with from the game's life cycle and where you think it's going to go. So
I like those answers. Those are really
Mm.
really strong
Mhm.
answers. I always talk about it about articulation, like articulating the idea, conveying the idea. Can you confidently and cleanly and concisely convey your idea to somebody? And for the prototype, it's like through graphic design, through your rules, and at a pitch, it's through your words and your actions, right? Through your sell sheet, it's in the pictures and the words. So anytime you can do that, it's probably ready.
yeah,
And so, and here's the caveat to that, and that goes to my don't waste time and don't make people feel stupid rules. Is that if you cannot back up your promises, like you just gave me a promise that I'm going to experience this when I play this game. If your game doesn't back that up, we're done, right?
Yeah.
I don't want this. So that's what you have to make sure is that there is alignment between what you're saying and how the game performs, right? That is,
yeah,
there's a big sell, there's a big promise, and the number one thing that makes customers, and you can think of people you're pitching to as customers, regret the time they've spent, the money they spent, anything that they spent, is when it doesn't live up to the expectation. So this is why I very strongly recommend do not use hyperbole when you're
yeah,
pitching. Like,
It's
if you
the
say, "This is
best
the best
thing
game
since
ever," right? "This is gonna destroy everything you ever knew about,
the
collectible
ultimate.
card games," right?
yeah.
It's just be humble,
I had the best drafting game you've never played, and it's like,
right?
sure, you and 27,000 other people do as well, right? So,
Yeah, yeah.
That's the salesy aspect that works in some cases, but again, sales background. It's actually not important, all of that stuff. It's how it fits the person. So, oh, you like this kind of a game? Well, let me show you this. So find out something and then match them to it. That's
Yep.
So I had a look at your website before we met up, and I noticed that you really like cozy games. So while you said that you were interested in this, that's actually not as cozy as this. I paid attention to you. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? So
yeah.
let's
Uh,
marry you with this thing.
Helena says, "I would love
Oh.
to, for once, get a game that is completely developed." And it's hard. Like, getting a completely developed game is hard, especially when you as a publisher, have different visions, right?
Sure.
And I'll just kind of put my developer hat on because that's what I do. Is my job as a developer is to align the vision of the designer with the vision of the publisher. That's it. That's how
Yeah.
simply I can put it, right? And so you might get a game that the designer thinks is fully developed, but because you are a different brand and have different audiences and have a different vision for it, it just isn't anymore. So it is really hard to come across that fully developed game that you will take as is. I think that's also a problem. Not a problem, but it's just a factor, right? Is that
It's a challenge. Yeah.
because Helena, as you just outed yourself, you love developing the games. I don't know if a game is ever done because I think as designers, we're often told your game is never done, it's just published,
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
That's kind of an adage,
yeah.
and I don't know if that's harming or hurting us, or if it's letting the industry work as it should, where developers get to do the work of making it the final thing that allows everybody who's part of this to have their voice and their vision in the product, right?
And that's
I
also
feel
part of
what
the relationship, right, Scott?
definitely.
Understanding like how developed your publisher wants your game to
Sure.
be.
Actually had someone ask me that today, actually this morning. They said, how much do you like to develop in house? Like, do you want something that you get at 80%, or to Jay's point, 83%, and like you take it from a certain point forward, or do you want something at 100%, or do you want something really low? And I thought that was a really smart question to ask, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
while we're a very large company, we have 64 employees, and some of them are developers and game designers. Not everyone has that, and not everyone has the capability to do that, right? It's funny, as you were talking about that, Sen, the thing that kind of popped in my head was an analogy back to Hollywood, that the game developers kind of like the director, right? The director of the movie may not have written the script for the movie. They may not have written the storyboard and what this whole experience is going to be, but they have to take what the producer wants from a money perspective and what the artist wants from a creative perspective and bring those things together. And that's really kind of where the developer sits, which is it's a pretty challenging role sometimes. So
Yeah, that's actually my favorite role, to be honest. I quite enjoy that. Um,
And that's
but
nice to
yeah,
actually spotlight the developers a little bit, because often developers aren't really taken into account. People kind of mash
yep.
that into designer, but that's not true. Like, there's design, and then there's all of the stuff that, and some of us do both, but there's all this really important stuff that actually makes that, pretty little idea into a game.
This will probably speak a little
We
bit to
can't do
Jay's
that.
heart, but it's like it's almost the difference between a graphic designer and a graphic artist, right? There's two very different skill sets involved with each of those things. They're both very talented, but they do slightly different things. Same thing between a designer and a developer. They're both very talented, but they're looking at two very different things at very different times. So
and people can do both roles.
yeah,
And
totally.
sometimes people do multiple things, right? There are people out there who make their whole game like Ammon did everything on his game,
Yeah.
which is quite remarkable, and
Yep.
it's a really cool game. Jessica Andres says or asks, what kind of skills other than sales pitches are considered highly valued when evaluating a potential partnership?
Good
Wonderful question.
question.
Love it.
That is.
What
I
do you think,
mean,
Scott?
being able to snap a quarter from across the room and hit somebody. No, I'm kidding. Tap dancing. What other skills can I think of?
Ninja
I,
skills.
I think, yeah, everyone should have ninja skills of some type, right?
Nope,
There
I
you
guess
go. Look at
no,
that.
I
That's
don't. I
pretty
can't.
good.
No.
I
Don't
can't
hit
do
the
that at
camera. Don't hit the
all.
camera. We don't need to end
I'm
like
never going to get a
prematurely.
game signed. I can't do that at all.
Um, I think one. This is a tough question, and this is a really good question. I think one of the bigger ones, and this is a tough one to really put out there, but it requires some homework, is understanding a bit about the industry and how the industry impacts your game. If you come to a meeting and you have a game that has a bunch of miniatures, but you want to make it for $30, and you tell the publisher, I really want this to be like a family plus weight game, but I want all these beautiful minis, you're probably not 100% aligned on where it's going to end up. And that's kind of an extreme example, because I really wouldn't expect anyone to do that. But there are things like understanding the impact of the components that you'll use in the game and how that may or may not align to the publisher that you're talking to and what kind of things they're going to want to make. One of my biggest things I always tell people is don't just randomly throw spaghetti against the wall. Don't try to find a bunch of publishers. Don't randomly walk up to people at 4:45 on Sunday at Gen Con and say, hey, can I pitch you my game? Although that did work for one person I know, and it was a miracle, but that's a whole other story. But I think one of the biggest things is understanding what is the company that you're pitching to, what is their brand, what is the message, what is their consumers, what are they trying to do in the marketplace, and being able to say my game fits your line really well and here's why, right? And I think that takes the discussion to a whole nother level, because you talked at the very beginning, Sen, about caring, right? And that is a very big part of this. And I'll call them out as well on this, but this was a great conversation. And this was a 3:45 thing on a Sunday at a show. I'm at UK Games Expo in 2018, and a friend of mine that worked for Asmodee UK came to me and he said, I know you get asked this all the time. I know it's terrible that it's like Sunday afternoon, but there's a friend of mine here. We've already sold his game. He's amazing, and he can't get anyone from distribution to come talk to him or even, look at his game. And we, Asmodee UK, we've already sold like 2,000 units of this game. And I'm like, wow, okay. I'm like, sure. I mean, we're walking out anyway. We're gonna walk by his booth. Like, let's check it out. And it was Frank West from City of Games, and most people know him for Isle of Cats. And at the time, he was pitching City of Kings, which is a really, really big game. And when I got to his booth, he saw me and he saw my friend, and he kind of gave us the high sign because he knew who I was with. And immediately he looked at us. He said, please give me just 1 minute. I just need to finish with this customer real quick. And I was like, sure, no problem. And he turned around and he proceeded to spend the next like 10 minutes finishing out a conversation with the consumer, making them feel extremely seen and paid attention to, while also making us feel the same way, but understanding, hey, I just need a couple of minutes to take care of this. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, this guy is already like very impressive in terms of how he's handling himself and how he's handling the surroundings for everything. Because as most of us know, like 3:45 on a Sunday, it's like chaos. Like everything's going on. People are already starting to try and break down booze without getting yelled at and stuff, and it can get
Trying
kind
to
of
trade their
crazy.
games away.
Right? Yeah, exactly. So it's pretty wild. But I think that's a big part of it, is being able to show who you are as a person is a big thing. So
hmm It's a trust relationship. Like you are
Mm.
entering into a long-term relationship where you trust that your publisher is your partner. Like we don't audit people's books. We just trust that they're paying us our royalties, right?
sure.
We have
Mhm.
to, right? And so, I mean, just from a Lucky Duck perspective, I have several games with Lucky Duck,
Yep.
and I
Kingdom
have
Rush
some,
is awesome.
yeah, I have some issues with payment, not because of them, because of me. And I just trust that when I get that resolved, it's a tax thing. Um, that my money's still going to be there, right? I have
We
to
will
trust
send
them.
your money to the Swiss bank account. Don't worry about it. We'll
Thank you.
take
I can look after it for you.
There you go. Yeah. Cat's your conservator.
There you go.
I'll do that. I can do
Okay.
that for you.
You can? Awesome.
Yeah, I will.
For Tessa, what do you think are some other skills other than just like pitching skills that are valuable in a potential partner?
Sure. I think when you're looking at a potential partner and a publisher, you also need to be able to, one, evaluate your communication styles. And this goes into researching because every publisher will have a different communication style and a different level of involvement that they're looking for from the designer. Some just want to take the baby and just go ahead and put it through their process, but others are perfectly happy to have the game designer, walk hand in hand with their development team and make sure that it follows whatever vision that the designer had until the end. So that's something that you want to discuss once you decide to commit with a company, and make sure that everything's out in the open before you sign anything. And then I would say that the other thing that's super important is uh, being able to kind of market your game. While it's entirely on the publisher to market their game, I think it's also a plus if you are able to promote your games in ways where you can submit them into different contests, or if you can kind of get it in front of people's eyes. That's always seemed like a plus to kind of validate the interest in your game, and why it may sell or set itself apart from other games that it's competing against.
Like Troy's comment with the community building, not just on social media, but just in general. I think at conventions, everywhere that you possibly
Yeah.
can, I think that's really important, because these will potentially be your super fans that help make sure that your game is successful and people have heard of you. And
hmm There's a lot of that. What about you, Jay? What do you think that some skills other than sales pitching are valuable as what do you bring to the table, Jay?
Stop making this. I'm joking. Stop. No, I think all of the things that have been mentioned already are my kind of top things. Like, you want a partner who is able to communicate, kind of be open about the things they want, the things they don't want, the things that they're okay with changing. Um, you want someone who is invested enough to, want to promote their game and is already kind of building a community around what the game's experience is, because it only helps, right? You want someone who's passionate, and or I would imagine that publishers want someone who's just not gonna, take the game to the side and be like, okay, now it's your thing to deal with. While that might be okay for some publishers,
It
it's
depends,
it's
right?
a plus. Yeah, yeah.
the
Um,
ability to unplug from it, I think, is probably helpful, but
yeah,
not caring.
yeah.
Yeah. It,
That's a good question to ask, though. Like, if you're in
mhm.
a conversation with a publisher, is because I had this bite me really hard once, actually, is, you don't necessarily, especially not on the first date, so to speak, want to say like, hey, what's in your contract, or what should I expect in your contract? But being able to have a conversation about, do you plan to change things possibly? How
Mhm.
much do you change?
Yes.
Or can you tell me about another game that you recently published, and did you change much about it? that's something that I recently had happen. There was a designer that we were working with Lucky Duck. They actually went to another designer that we worked with and just asked them, "What's your experience been like? Like, how have you liked working with them? Have they been responsible? Have they been reliable? Have they been communicative?" And I told them, I'm like, kudos on you. Like that's a smart thing to do, because that's putting a little bit of your trust out there where you're just contacting a random stranger, which thankfully you're both doing the same thing, designing a board game, but you're like, hey, like I'm talking to a company I know you worked with. Like, what can you share with me? What can you tell with me? And to Jay's point earlier about this being such a small industry, it's a $4 billion industry, and it's still very small, which is crazy to kind of think of in the whole scheme of things. Of course, half of it's owned by one company, but that's a longer story for a different podcast.
The
But
company's
it
name is
is something
Asmodee.
that when you have those relationships, or even want to try and foster those relationships, I think for the most part, most people in this industry are very willing to have conversations about, this was my good experience, this was my maybe not so good experience, and maybe this is what your mileage might be, which is really kind of cool.
Hi to Evan Halbert. So yeah, there's a couple other things like Jessica. So on the other side of it, like you want to make sure that you're getting into a partnership with somebody that you trust, right?
Mhm.
Don't necessarily just sign the first contract because you want to get your game out there. And that is a mistake that some people have made. And we've actually made it with a company that did not do good by anybody. Where it's like we had no other place that would want this game, and they're like, "Oh, we want it." It's like, okay, whatever. We just wanted to kind of get it out of our back catalog, and it ended up biting us in the butt quite hard in a lot of ways. But the other thing is like, if you see a company that has a non-disparagement clause in their contract, run away.
Mhm.
Run away.
Yep.
There are definitely trade secret things, like you cannot really legally talk about your contract in some
Right.
ways, shapes, and forms. There are some parts, but if they're gagging you that said that you
Depending
can't
on where
talk
you are in
about.
the world.
Yes, right? If they're gagging you and saying you can't talk bad about us ever, that's not a company you wanna work for. That's a company that is planning some shady stuff,
Yeah,
potentially, right?
usually if somebody has to say those things, there's a reason they have to say
Yeah.
them, and it's not
Right?
usually a good one, right? So
Yeah.
Parallel to
Oh,
that is also how well they handle they handle feedback. So one of the big reasons to do lots of playtesting is to cope with feedback from people, so that when publishers come back to you and say, this whole section of your game not working, you don't go, you go, okay, tell me what you
sure.
yeah.
mean, and you can handle it. So that's another skill.
Yeah, Helena says this is truly a partnership, but if you're not getting the information that you need up front, they're probably not a good partner, right? That
Mhm.
Yeah,
that's a very good thing. Like, so here's another thing that you got to understand when you are one designer working for a larger publisher, especially a larger publisher, is that you are one designer. That's one game out of their maybe 12 games on the slate for the year. You might not get all the time, and you might not get everything immediately, but you will get it to you eventually if they're good.
sure.
If somebody's constantly putting you off, that's a sign, right? That's not a good sign.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
oh, Jessica asks, great answers. What about skills in project management, or is that something that publishers assume the role of? That is a very interesting question. Very interesting question. We've already mentioned Scott Gata's name once, so let me just mention him again. Is that some publishers, like Scott Gata for Renegade, will let the designers do a lot of stuff if the designer is good at that thing. So Kane Klenko did a lot of art direction and is now doing a lot of project management on his own projects. So it's not necessarily out of the realm of ordinary for people to be able to do things that they're good at, right? Obviously, if Jay Bell signed his game with Scott, Scott might say, "Hey, do you want to actually do the graphic design for your game?" And Jay
It's
Bell might
happened
say,
before.
"Yeah, exactly, right?"
Yeah,
Or, um, if I'm there, they might say, "Oh, we want you to, we were gonna do a bunch of fiction. Do you want to write the fiction? Because I'm a writer." And I'm like, "Yeah, sure, let's do that."
sure.
Or Kat doing some of the art, right? So there's all these things where your residual skills, if you can talk about them, if you can show them, that might be something where you might either get a bigger cut, you might, get more say in how the game actually gets made. You might even just learn a thing or two that helps you
Sure.
become a self-publisher eventually, right? So there's
Yeah.
a lot of benefit to going through the process with a publisher. Like, honestly, if I was to do this all again, I would probably do it the exact same way and get my first game published by a publisher just to learn, right?
Sure.
Because we're playing with their money, not my money.
Yes. Yeah.
It's always easier with house money, right?
Right, exactly.
No, I think that's a
As
great
someone
point.
actually who has project management experience, I'd just like to say, all of us who have developed a game, who have taken a game from idea to having it ready to pitch, have project management skills, because you may not know, and it may have been a mess because, first time, but especially if you've got multiple games on the go, you are a project manager and you are managing multiple projects and you are delivering because they're getting to pitch or they're getting to publish.
You may not be a scrum master yet, but
that's right. Or you may not have your people. Yeah, all of those.
Talking like a good PMP professional.
Oh my gosh.
I was like, no, I'm not gonna. No, there it is.
I think the answer to Jessica's question, though, is if you have skills like that, it's good to have the conversation. It's good to share those things and have that kind of discussion with the publisher about these are the things I can do. And maybe they take everything and go, this is awesome. Or maybe they just take bits and pieces of that and say, well, this is how it can align, right?
And just to clarify, Evan, that's not a rugby scrum we're talking about.
It's not, no.
Although, yes, it can be equally brutal if you don't have a good scrum master.
Yes, also can be brutal. So, is there anything else anybody has like a dying need to talk about? We've already gone through games or experiences in a box. We've already gone through, put your authentic best self forward. We've talked about sell sheets and graphic design is more important than illustration and show don't tell. We've talked about, doing your research. Fertessa made that very clear. Don't waste people's times. Don't make people feel like they're stupid. Comps are not always the greatest thing to use in board games for lots of reasons. Hyperbole, not a wonderful thing to use. Oh, we haven't talked about this.
Yeah,
this
I was
is a
about
great
to say,
question.
there's this, and there's also, we haven't talked about prototypes.
Yes, here we go. So, Joffrey Seacrest asks, what's the role of a short pitch video? Are publishers expecting these? Do they replace the need for a sell sheet? All great questions. And yes, F racism.
Yes, I was just gonna say, great shirt. So, what's the role of short pitch videos? So to me, the role of a short pitch video is either augmenting or replacing your physical sell sheet. But it's by no means anything we're expecting from a publisher standpoint. This is very much like Jay's skill in graphic design. Video editing and video creating is a skill in and of itself, and it's not a very easy one to pick up immediately. So it's not something we would ever expect. It's definitely a nice to have, not a need to have kind of thing. If you have those skills, again, if you have those capabilities, that's awesome. And it does help you potentially reach more publishers where, we've talked a lot about being at shows and being at a Gen Con or being at an SN and sharing your game with people. But if you can't get there, then the digital trailer is a great way to be able to say, hey, and I mean, let's be honest, we kind of talked about it a little bit at the beginning, but it's like, after my experience at Gamma last week, I definitely 1000% do not feel comfortable not masking at shows. I know 15 people from Gamma just personally that already have COVID and have tested positive, and thankfully none of them have been terribly bad, but it's still bad when you get it because you have the risk of infecting other people as well. So there's a lot of people that are still struggling with immunocompromised situations, or they can't go out because someone they know or they're close to has those challenges. So having those digital sell sheets, so to speak, or these videos are a great way to reach more people in that way without having to be face to face. And I think again, not a need to have, but if you're in the situation where you do need to have it, they're a great tool to be able to kind of expand who you're talking to.
Yes, masks.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, the thing with the videos is it might not be a skill that you have now, but it's definitely a skill that's worth developing because, as Scott mentioned, entering competitions is a really good idea. And a lot of those competitions ask for a little short video. So you might as well learn. I mean, I taught myself to do it. I'm not terribly good at it, but I have a video now for some of my games. So I can just be like, okay, cool, chuck that in there.
And if you want to get into mass and the toy and game side of games, which is different than the hobby side of games, you need sizzle reels. Sizzle reels, they don't have to be very long. They can be 2 minutes. In fact, they'd love them to be 2 minutes. They'd love them to be shorter. And all you're really showing in a lot of these is the hook.
Yep.
And at some point, if you want to really talk about the difference between like bait and a hook, I made a video on it. It's on YouTube. You can go find it. It's like bait versus hook, because a lot of people think that their bait is their hook, and it's not.
And that's
You
really hard
gotta,
to learn.
yeah, you gotta differentiate between that. But the video, I think it's becoming more and more of a tool. We all have this, a lot of us have these pocket cameras that make really good videos, and you can just edit. I made my first sizzle reel on my iPhone with iMovie and a voiceover. Like really,
Nice.
just voice it. Just do a voiceover. You don't have to record everything while you're moving your hands. It's like I moved my hands. Actually, Scott, my one of my design partners, moved all the pieces, and we said, okay, what do we need to show? Let's show this. Let's show this. And then I spliced it all together and I narrated over it with just a simple voiceover, and it worked. It worked fine. It doesn't have to be perfect. They're not expecting high budget sizzle reels. They're
Dramatic
expecting,
music,
Although I
mean,
will say
sure.
now that you mentioned that,
lighting.
like if somebody sends me a sizzle reel and the first thing I see is like, in a world where Senfung Lim displays his newest game, like, that would be pretty
Yeah,
awesome.
Will
it
you
would
do the
be.
voiceover for mine, please?
Sure.
That's magnificent.
Scott does have a nice voice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Evan, you're right. A few publishers require sell sheet and videos. And then, obviously COVID is making an impact on the need for a video. And there's different videos, right? So some people ask for the sizzle first, and then eventually they'll say, okay, we like it, or we want to see more. Can you give us a full playthrough video or a rules video? So each of them get longer, but actually are easier to make. The
Sure.
sizzle reel is actually hard to make because you have to take so much and condense it, whereas a playthrough is just you recording yourself playing and
Right.
And a
talking while you're
sizzle
playing.
reel and a pitch video aren't quite the same, are they?
Nope.
Not really.
Some people have told me they're the same, and I'm like, I don't think so. I feel like a sizzle reel is much more in a world whereas
Right.
a pitch video is like, hi, I'm Kat from Drink, and this is my game.
Yeah.
That's right.
So another thing I actually find more effective than pitch reels or pitch decks. So a pitch deck would be like a Google Slides or PowerPoint, and you can animate on that really actually
Yeah.
quite easily, and you can record while it's playing. Like 10 seconds per slide or whatever, and just have like 5 slides, and you got your minute, and you just talk over the slides as they go, and you can show in a much more controlled manner than you can with moving pieces around in front of a camera when you're also the one looking through the camera, right? So think about making your pitch decks and then animating them or recording them with voiceover. I think it's a much easier tool in some ways than recording a frame by frame video. We're talking about, a lot of work in some ways.
So there was something else that we
Uh,
talked about that is probably good to mention, and this
sure.
kind of goes back to the relationship piece of things. You mentioned earlier about how when people can, meet up with publishers in person, that it's usually sometimes after a long day or a long week, and who knows, they may have just come away from the worst pitch ever, right? Like you never really know what happened 5 minutes before you meet someone. And I'm a big believer that everyone's dealing with tragedy in some form or fashion. It's just a matter of how much they show it. But again, longer story, taller drink.
Mhm.
But I think one of the more fabulous things you can do as a designer is take time in advance to reach out and schedule an appointment, because it's very challenging for publishers at shows. And I say this with a bit of a caveat because we're a very big company and we have a lot of employees. But even with a lot of employees, when you're at a show, you're being pulled like an octopus on a tricycle, like every different direction at once. And when someone walks up randomly and says, "Do you guys take game pitches? Can I pitch you my game real quick?" That's a really tough situation to be put in, because we more than likely would like to say yes, but we may be being pulled by several different factors that don't really allow us to do that. Whereas being able to schedule things, even just a couple of weeks in advance of the show, being able to reach out and say, "Are you guys going to be taking pitches at the show? Can we talk with you? Is there a time? Is there a place to meet?" Something like that. That can go a long way to helping establish that kind of foundation of, I respect your time, you respect my time.
Mhm.
Let's get together and start to build this relationship, which is really good.
So the last thing I wanted to make sure we covered was prototypes.
Sure.
So I've heard all kinds of different things. I've been told all kinds of different things, from I should only have one prototype that I demo and I hang on to it and I don't let anyone take it, to I should only have my prototype digitally and I should always expect publishers to be willing to play it digitally, to I should always carry at least 5 prototypes so that I've got one to give away. All of these feel wrong to me. I think that somewhere in between all of those is probably the best way to sit. What's the best thing for you, Scott? How do you like us to show up in terms of
Sure.
prototypes?
I think it's extremely challenging to run around with 5 of anything in your backpack. Right? Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if it's a board game or if it's like a water bottle or whatever it might be. So that can be really challenging.
No, I'm not
I
doing
think
that.
in terms of leaving your prototype with somebody, that definitely comes down to the trust factor and your discussions that you've had with them. I would definitely not recommend to just, again, spaghetti against the wall and throw your prototypes anywhere you want to go. It's funny. When I live in Kansas City now, and I used to live in Texas. And when I was in Texas, I would go to these design meetups at Dragon's Lair in Austin, Texas, which was super fun. And one of the biggest questions I used to get asked was, well, should I ask for an NDA? Like, should I, if I'm going to share my design with someone, do I need to ask for an NDA? And I always used to tell people, I don't think you realize how long it takes to make a board game, because even if you showed me the most amazing thing on the planet right now that I was like, this is a Catan killer, like it's gonna win Spiel des Jahres back to back, like it's that good, it's amazing. It's going to take me probably a minimum of a year to actually copy that and put it out into production. So even if I was the worst person on the planet and wanted to just steal your design and run away with it, it's not like I can just snap my fingers and suddenly there's 5,000 units sitting in a warehouse. Like that takes a lot of time. But I think in terms of digital versus physical, and in terms of what you share, I think digital is a great tool. And I caveat that with, not all of the digital tools available to us in the industry are great, if that makes sense. I think there's some things that are existing out of the necessity of them to exist. And I think other things may not be as advanced as we'd like them to be, which makes it a little challenging.
It's very diplomatic.
Yes, I'm trying to choose my words very specifically here. So.
A lot of the platforms that we have to use to test with do not accurately reflect the physical experience of playing a game.
Completely. But from a digital perspective, like if you look at a company like Lucky Duck, where we have developers and designers in Poland, and you may be a North American designer, it's a lot easier to just say, let's hop online and I'll show you the game real quick and we can walk through it on everything like that. One thing I would highly recommend is if you do have a digital prototype like that, whether it's on an existing tool or something maybe you amazingly create on your own, which I have seen before, definitely try to control that environment as much as possible. Because to your point, Kat, when you sit down at a digital tool, it's very easy to bump something or move things around. And suddenly that experience that you as a designer wanted someone to have is totally different than what they're actually having. So being able to kind of control that as much as possible is really important, I think.
So for example, building in snap points, having a reset, all of those sorts of options that'll help you recover.
Yep.
And as for physical prototypes, how fancy does someone's prototype need to be to show you? Do the people need to be scrambling to get their prototype professionally printed, Game Crafter, Print Play, those sorts of things? Can they show up with some bits of paper? Like, what level is good enough?
I think the answer to that is it's good enough if it conveys the experience you want it to convey.
That's lovely.
If you look at something and you say, if I left this with someone blindly and they're going to have to do it on their own, are they going to have the experience I want them to have? And if the answer is no, it's probably not at the level you want it to be at. If it's yes, then great. You're ready to rock and hand it out, which is really cool. So.
And that was my last question. Should it have a rule book?
It would be really nice. Yes. It would be really nice.
Well, I mean, in a lot of cases, I've pitched and explained it, but I haven't given them the rule book.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to your earlier question about how should you bring prototypes whenever you're going to a convention? Just from my personal experience, when I actually did have a prototype that publishers were interested in. Uh, I just had the one prototype, and also it helps if you document what changes you made to your prototype so you know what stage it is if it differs from
Versioning.
whenever you left home. But then also, if a publisher is interested in it, often they're going to have their bags full with plenty of stuff and wouldn't even have room to take your prototype and keep it safe.
Mm-hmm.
And in my experience, the publisher just said, "Hey, let's exchange information." And then after the convention, like 1-2 weeks after the convention, I'll reach out. They reached out and gave me an address and kind of a deadline that they needed my prototype from me, and then I had the chance to update it and then print it out and mail it that way and get it to them. So I think that's a lot more
Yeah.
practical than bringing
Yeah,
5.
they're not going to play it instantly, right?
No,
Yeah.
no.
They've
And
got
I mean,
business to take care of.
and obviously some of these questions I already knew the answer, but it's good to hear other people's answers to them.
Sure.
So just as a hint, if you are going to bring prototypes with you, sometimes like we do, and we pick one person to give that one lucky prototype away to, because usually we're pretty decent at what we do and we get multiple asks. And so there's a couple legal things you might want to think about, like rights of first refusal, all this kind of stuff that we can talk about at some other day.
Yeah.
It's basically just saying, hey, this is a company that has it, and I've already promised them that if a bid comes in, they have like 24 hours to counter any bid that comes in, that kind of thing, before we show it to somebody else. I think in today's day and age, most publishers are very aware that designers are showing their things to multiple people at multiple times. And this is a big change over the last like 10, 15 years. 10, 15 years ago, like you really didn't show your thing to more than one publisher at a time. And that's really changed. Um, Another thing is that we pack our prototypes in Ziploc bags instead of boxes because nobody has room for boxes. But a Ziploc bag can actually fit in almost anything. So
Yep.
just a little pro tip for you there. We have a question here from Devin. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say good point on something you said earlier. So it is very different. When I started in the industry in 2013, it was very much I'm pitching to X and that's it. And now, and Ammon's a great example. I know like 9 different publishers that want his game right now, and everyone's like fawning all over it. I think a very important part of developing a relationship with publishers is being very open with them about who you're talking to and what stage you're at with them. You know, if you say, I appreciate that you like my game and you want to look at it more, but I'm already talking with some other people and they are very well advanced in the discussions, those are a great thing to be able to share with people. I had a really bad experience at one point in the industry where I was at a show, saw a design, absolutely loved it. We told the person verbally, we want to do this. And then the next day, I'm talking to another publisher and he's like, man, I am so excited. And I'm like, what's going on? He goes, I found this game. This is what it is. And I'm like, this is the exact same game we just talked about last night. Like, is this the person you're working with? He goes, yeah. He goes, I just talked to him this morning and told him I wanted to do it. And we're like ready to rock. And I'm like, I talked to him last night and told him I was ready to rock. And I kid you not. And you're like, Kat, you're covering your mouth like, oh my goodness, this is so bad.
Oh, no.
It gets worse because as we're talking this through, a third publisher came up and they're like,
Also
hey,
their
guys, what's going
boyfriend.
on? And I'm like, oh, just talking, hanging out. We got a little bit of an issue where a designer has committed his game to both of us. And he goes, oh, well, I hope it's not this one. And I'm like,
Lol.
it is. I was like, there were 3 different publishers that they had verbally committed to. And I don't think they did it maliciously. I think they did it just out of naivety of not understanding the conversations and how they were going. But it was definitely a very rough experience. So being able to be open with publishers and say, here's who I'm talking to, here's what's going on. None of us will ever take offense. Like we've talked about, this is a very small industry. I told Ammon, I said, if I don't get to make your game, I hope this person does because I love them and I think it would be great. Like, I just want your game to be out there and be successful, right? So,
Yeah, if you remember the caveat about wasting people's time, here's a big
yep.
time waster. When, Lucky Duck puts a couple hours of play and development talk and thinking about, shifting their line around, and another company does it and you've just wasted all their time.
Yep.
because you've made promises that you cannot keep, right? You
And
can only sign it to one company.
bear in mind, you are absolutely entitled to investigate those relationships, but
Sure.
Yeah.
don't make promises.
Yeah.
Right.
That's the bit. Like,
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is the bit. So I wanted to ask before we continue on, can we continue on? We have a bunch of questions that
Sure.
people are there. Are you
they're
okay,
good
Scott?
questions too.
Yeah.
Fertessa,
I'm not
Jay, you
that
guys
old.
are
We're
okay?
not past my bedtime yet. So
All right, all right. Devin Talks Tabletop says, for publishers with existing game franchises, so say like Chronicles of Crime or Destinies, would you prefer for designers to bring designs to you that are semi-malleable in terms of theme or design so that they could be sculpted into a new entry into a line?
Sure. That's a tricky question because there are some relationships with an existing line that the designer of that original game has the rights for derivatives and expansions and things that we make. So, for example, like Chronicles of Crime, David's design, it's beautiful, it's wonderful. If somebody walked up and showed me something that would fit into that line, I would never be able to turn around and just say, "Sure, we'll do it. This is great." Like that's something I'd want to sit down with David and say, "Hey, this was brought to us. What's your opinion on this? Does this align to this? Should we do something different?" That's just being respectful to the person that created the original design on it.
Right.
Usually that could be a little different when we're talking about in-house studio designs, something that a team at a publisher made themselves. There's usually a little more flexibility than a line that was designed by an external designer that they franchised it or licensed it from in that case. So it's definitely an option, and it's something that you want to know before you pitch to them, because you don't, to the point of wasting time, you don't want to make like the best Destiny's game ever and that it's like Destiny's 2.0 and you come to Lucky Duck and then we're like, we really can't do anything with this, but thank you. Like, it's
Right,
like
yeah.
that's a real time suck.
Destiny's Child was right there.
Destiny's
Yeah, but
Child
you
was
totally
right
missed
there.
it.
It was right there.
You weren't
That'd be
ready for
great.
this jelly.
Yeah.
Left Eye Lopez, that would
Pretty
be
much.
awesome.
Yeah. This is a great question. Really, it's more of a
It's got a
comment.
second half.
Yeah. Well, oh yeah. I mean, Devin's question has a second half, which is, or do you want a fully fleshed out design? And if you want to adapt it to an existing game series, you'll just do the retroactive changes.
So I don't like that word fully fleshed out design because I hear a lot of people use it, and I know it's a very easy thing to use. I really don't think, and Sen, you're more than welcome to talk about this because you've gone through this so many times. When you pitch a game, even if it's perfect, even if it like the relationship is perfect, you hit it off, like everyone's high fiving and like throwing chimichangas in the air and everything's awesome. That game's not fully fleshed out the minute you
No.
sign it.
I'm
There's
sorry.
work.
I've got to stop you. Is that what we expect?
Yeah, well,
Because
I
that
mean,
sounds really
some
messy.
publishers roll big, Cat. That's all I can
Okay.
say,
I'm
right?
just
Yeah.
wondering if
Lots
we
of-
need to
lots
make
of
sure that we're
chimichangas.
in a safe
There
place.
you go.
The whole enchilada.
That's right.
Ah.
That's right. But I do think, to your point about your question, Devin, in terms of having a fully fleshed out design or adapting it, it usually is something that would be adapted to the series. So it doesn't necessarily need to be fully fleshed out. I think if you're going to be pitching to a publisher that you've already talked to and said, "Hey, I've got something that I think will fit your line. Do you want to talk about that?" And they say yes, you really just need to be able to show them something inspiring that fits the vision of that line and make sure it's in there. The Dark Quarter is a great example. I mean, when you look at what we did with Destinies and you look at what Evan did from Van Ryder, our partners with Dark Quarter, and what they did, taking a very good mechanical system and combining it with this noir, dark 80s grit, it was a really, really good fit. And obviously was very successful on Kickstarter. So obviously the public agreed with that. But it's something that you definitely want to make sure to have the right conversations ahead of time to make sure you're going into that to make it as successful as possible. And I just saw Ian O'Toole. I love you, bro. I hope everything's great. I miss your face. I hope everything's good.
That's the next question or comment. Ian O'Toole says, "Hi all. I've definitely found most designers are giving publishers links to TTS rather than handing over physical prototypes. Some never even build a physical prototype at all,
Yep.
which can cause issues."
Don't do this.
So, what kind of issues? Let's talk to Jay as a physical graphic designer, print product dude, and Kat as a person who makes physical product all the time, graphic design. Why should we not rely wholly on digital prototypes?
You go first,
Yeah,
Jim.
there was a lot of discussion about this in the Twitterverse, I think like 2 or 3 weeks ago. But point being, from my perspective, for me, it really depends on where I am in the world, and then also like what the design is determining if I start with physical or if I start with digital. Um, and that's coming from a place of having the privilege of having graphic design skills to be able to decide, oh, is this going to be easier for me to make physical or a digital prototype? Like the game that we did for the design jam that I made with the dice and the tray, that's never going to hit digital. One, because you're throwing dice, and two, because I don't know how to make a 3D tray for me to throw those dice into. So that's never going to be digital. But for other games, certainly, if I need to play test with a bunch of people, then I'll probably do it digitally because it's harder for me to make appointments in my physical location right now. But yeah, absolutely.
But
Digital
never ever
playtesting,
making a physical version of it, though.
yeah, digital playtesting, it doesn't allow you, in my opinion, to really understand how that game is going to be, how it's going to
Exactly.
Mhm.
feel physically. There's a big difference, no matter how scripted or how
Well, in fact,
polished.
less scripting is better in some in some cases.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. There's
The,
there's no, not yet at least. I've never seen a digital replication of a game that really mimicked the physical feel, the analog feel of playing games. And there's nothing wrong with digital play testing, but physical is absolutely necessary in my opinion.
Mhm.
as Evan says in his comment there, it'll largely be played in physical form.
Yep.
And the experience might be significantly different from how it is digitally. But also, one of the main errors I've seen from like chilling out in the game design groups and things like that is people who are like, oh, damn, I just finally decided to try and make a physical version of my prototype and realized that all of the physics in the online environment have been making this thing possible that I literally cannot build. I
Yep.
cannot make
Yeah.
this, I can't do the thing.
Or
Or
people will
like, or they have things that stack, or they have things that click together, and all of, and if you actually physically try and do it, this is misery. It's fiddly,
misery.
or it's
Yep.
just gonna weigh
Yeah.
200 kilos, or
Or it's
just
gonna cost $2 billion, right? Like,
exactly.
hey, I have this game and we have like 73 dice in it, and they're all
Oh, that
custom.
sounds normal.
Yeah,
Sure.
Yeah, you
yeah.
can make that digitally because it's
Yeah.
pretty much
$20.
Kind of.
Let's
free.
put it
And
out right now.
that's the, I mean, designing from the perspective of how you're going to build it, as
Yep.
boring as that
Yeah,
sounds, is
yeah.
really important. You need to include that quite early,
Yeah,
because
that
I
sounds like a
didn't to
Panda
start
Games
with.
thing.
I didn't want to plug, but I've unfortunately had people try and manufacture and get quotes for games that they've never made a physical prototype of, and it takes a
Ooh.
lot to understand, a lot of experience to understand that turning an idea into a game is very different than turning a game into a manufacturable product.
Yes,
Yeah.
And you've got to design with manufacturing in mind.
Yep.
That's why we do that seminar at every convention we go to.
Yeah.
makes so
I
much
mean,
sense.
just simple little things like your computer is going to do the click togethery thingies. If you try and do that with your fingers, actually it goes flying,
Yep.
and you
Right.
can't find the bits, and oh
Yep.
no, and none of this balances together, or just like,
Yeah.
this is not a fun time. But my computer was doing it.
Let's see. James Takanaka is saying he found out that a publisher had given the distribution rights to their game, and that he had pre-orders already, and they said that they gave rights to somebody else. And oh my gosh, his solicitations and pre-orders were already out there. Scott, this
Ah,
Yikes.
sounds like your old world,
Ew, yeah, that's a bad day in Bosnia right there. That's
right?
not fun.
Oh my gosh.
mm-mm.
Oh, hello, Bree.
Hi, Bree.
I know her.
I know Bree. Bree is the champion of gnomes everywhere. Let me tell you.
She
Uh,
is. She is. She was a very hard proponent of Gnome Hollow, even
yeah.
back before Gamma and all the explosions started, which was really awesome.
I've heard the stories.
Yep.
Ian is saying that digital can cause some designers to forget real world questions such as, is this token 1 millimeter
Oh yeah.
wide, or will this game fit on a table? I have literally seen that, Ian. I've
Yep.
literally seen people make
Mhm.
digital things, and I asked them, do you realize how big this is going to be on a table? They said, oh, I never thought about that. I'm like, well,
Yep.
you should, because the average table size is X, right?
Who mentioned the cards? I just saw a comment about, yes, Troy saying shuffling 200 cards. Yeah, that takes seconds in a digital prototype. When you're actually handling 200 cards and they're all over the place and you're playing 200 card pickup, which is your new game. No.
If Arc Nova wasn't Arc Nova, I'm not sure people would like that giant stack of cards, right?
Right.
So,
Yeah, Bree's saying that it oversimplifies the actions on TTS because they're very easy, but really fiddly and time consuming and not fun in physical form. And the vice versa is also true, that sometimes it oversimplifies actions on TTS, like through scripting, that everybody thinks, oh, this game's a wrap. Except they forgot that all the procedural stuff that the computer is handling now has to be handled by people, and people forget.
Or the setup, when you're always having the machine do the setup, and so you go, okay, well, my game starts like this. Then someone buys it, and they're like, okay, well, that actually took me 3 hours to set up, and I don't feel like playing.
Here's a question from James. James says, based on what Kat said, Scott, are you starting to consider the physical weight of games and components when you're determining MSRPs?
Yes,
so that's always something you think about.
We could have an entire podcast on box size and why it matters and why it shouldn't matter. Yes, the short answer to that question is yes. Weight, dimensional shipping, it's brutal, like absolutely brutal in this industry. It's probably one of the biggest gotchas, especially for new publishers and new Kickstarter proponents. They get their game, they get everything done, and then they get slapped with this UPS bill, and they're like, what is this? Like, this is nothing of what I expected at all. So, yeah, weight is a very big thing. We're actually, later this year, we're releasing a game called Paper Apps Dungeon, and it's an all eco game. Like, there's going to be no plastic in it at all.
Oh, I'm so happy.
And, yeah, really proud about that. But it was a game that we could have gone completely the other direction with and made it, like, really heavy with a lot of non-eco-friendly stuff, and because of that it's going to be so much lighter and so much physically better to ship the game.
Interesting. That's a great point.
Even managing the weight of the game is eco-friendly. Because it costs less fuel to move,
and the size is eco-friendly because you can fit more on a pallet. There's all sorts of benefits,
and you're not shipping air.
Exactly.
Yep. Helena, who's out there, we are going to interview Helena at some point on Ludology about this very thing, because Endeavor was made with as little plastic as possible. So we're going to try to go through the process of, what new materials are out there. She used some sugarcane derivative to make the insert and all this really cool stuff.
Wait, does that mean I can eat the insert?
I don't know. I'm
you
not
can
exactly
always
sure.
eat the insert.
I mean, that's true. It's just a matter of if it's safe or not. That's true.
And I'm sure Jay knows a bunch of the product as well. So
there's a lot of stuff.
I mean, that's just like mushrooms, right? You can eat any mushroom.
This is true. This is true.
Well, it is true. You just might die.
You
lots and lots of other
get
stuff.
to eat it twice.
Yeah. So other things like merging a pencil with the die to remove a component with no plastic. All sorts of stuff.
Oh, that sounds cool.
Evan wants a game that's made out of marzipan.
Ew.
Oh, and Bree's saying that the next big TikTok trend is going to be eating inserts. So Scott, you can start the next big TikTok trend. I'm sure.
Just sprinkle a little Tide Pod over it. Everything will be great.
Oh, that sounds delicious.
It does not. It does not. Well, everybody, you know what? We've been here for 1 hour and 45 minutes, y'all. And it was a great topic, and I'm so happy that Scott, you were here to talk with us. Fertessa, Jay, Kat, and everybody in the chat, it was wonderful having you here. Fertessa, any last minute things you want to talk about?
No, I have my games out, Wicked and Wise and Mansplaining and Book of Villainy. So if you see them, try and check them out. But otherwise, I'll just be on the web.
There you go. And shouts out to Bonda, who's the co-designer of Mansplaining, in the chat. There you go. Jay Bell, anything you want to plug?
No, I don't think so. Hit me up anytime on social media, Twitter, Facebook, BJ Bell. I'll be around at conventions. So yeah.
There you go. Well, we'll get to your handles in a second. Mondo is asking if you haven't talked about it yet. Is there a projection about what the industry will look like in the coming years. So, Mondo, I advise you, we don't have time to talk about it today, but if you do want to hear what Eric Lang had to say about it, you can go listen to the episode that Erica and I did with him on ludology. It's very much exactly that, where Erica, myself, and Eric talk about the past, the present, and the future projections, given what we see in the industry today, especially with the big old COVID thing that went on there, right? So
I actually just did a
excellent.
conversation like that with Edo Baroff. So if you want to check
Yes,
that
Oh,
out
yeah.
too,
also
that was a great conversation.
Edo is
Um,
wonderful as well.
Who's going to Origins?
Apparently, Joffrey Seacrest is.
Yeah, well, I'll be
There you
there.
go.
Say hi.
I will
I
not be
might
at
go. I might be there. I'm not sure yet. We'll see. We'll see.
Yep.
Amy, get better, please. You know,
Yeah.
it's very disheartening to hear that you got the COVID, but I'm wishing you the best. So if you want to talk to me more, you can reach me at Senfeng Lim on Twitter. Kat, where are you?
At Drink on all the things.
On all the things. And you can reach both Kat and I through at Meeple Syrup, although I usually I usually tweet through at Senfeng Lim and just tag at Meeple Syrup right now. Scott, where can people reach you if they'd like to talk to you?
I'm in Kansas City. You're welcome to come anytime. No,
No,
you can just
don't
find
swim
me
in his
on.
pool. Don't swim in his
No,
pool.
What's
I.
his address?
It's not even a pool. It's more of like a concrete hole, and that's it. So, no, I'm Crits Happen on Twitter and pretty much everywhere else. So, and then
Yeah, there you go.
LuckyDuckGames.com, of course.
Yeah, and you can email Scott at scott@luckyduckgames.com.
Yep.
Just don't send him spam. Send him good stuff. Okay. Fertessa, where can people find you?
You can find me at Fertessa pretty much anywhere. And yeah,
You are the only one I know.
yes.
And you can also find DJ Bell at DJ Bell on
That's
Twitter.
true.
There you go.
That's where I am.
Excellent. Oh, Ammon says that he's going to hang out with you, Kat, at Origins.
Love it.
And Troy Caban is asking if you'll see anybody at the Korea Board Game Con or Tokyo Game Market. Those are
I
bucket
wish.
lists, right? Yeah,
That's
we
too
wish.
far for me today.
Yeah.
I know
Maybe
someone that
tomorrow.
will go to both of those, but I
Yeah.
won't be there.
Yeah, I know people who are going to them as well. So you'll
Yep.
definitely see Eric Price at many of those.
Yep.
You'll see a bunch of people there, so it'll be great. Yeah. So hopefully, we'd like to get more global comments from other people. Troy was on the show with us before, and so if you know anybody out there who's making games in other parts of the world, get them to reach out to us, because we want to know what is happening in the little parts of the industry that we don't get to focus on as much, with just how big Europe and North America are. So we had Fel from Brazil. I think we're going to have somebody from Turkey sometime in the
Nice.
future. We've had people
Yes.
from Korea.
Korea.
We've had people from Japan, but we want to talk about the global scene, right? Because we want to represent voices that haven't been heard yet. So thanks everybody for watching. It was great to see you all here. If you want to support us, you can link up at patreon.com/meeplesyrup. And Scott, do you have any final advice for people when they're pitching to anybody, not Lucky Duck in specific, but just in general? What's your last piece of advice? And I'm going to ask the same for Tessa and Jay as well.
Be yourself.
There you go. For Tessa, what's your last piece of advice?
My last piece of advice is get to know yourself and your weaknesses and your strengths. There are so many different ways that you can approach publishers, and you can find what works best for you. Don't let anybody rush your timeline. I started out, and a lot of people would say, "Oh, why didn't you show this and this publisher?" And I wasn't ready yet. So, whenever you're ready, no matter what people around you are saying. And, there are many different ways, no matter how socially awkward you may be or how, comfortable you are with speaking with other people. So just figure out what works for you.
There you go. And Jay Bell, what's your piece of final advice?
Oh my God, so much good advice already. But yeah, the industry's big and small at the same time, and everyone is more normal than you think.
And
Uh,
also weird.
so don't be afraid and set your own goals. Don't think that there's one way to go about this. Everybody achieves, success or validation differently.
There you go. Awesome. So what's coming soon? Let's see here. On May 10th, we have Rebecca Fordyce, Glenn Alcock, and Jennifer Kretschmer coming to talk about accessibility in general, and then specifically game design and accessibility. On May 17th, Kat.
We no longer have TBD. We have just landed the fantastic Ammon Anderson
Yeah, he's going
to
to come
talk
on
about that Gnome Hollow game that some
the
people
Gnome
have
Hollow
heard
game
of.
that people have heard of. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
And on May 24th, Lamarcus Shepard is coming to talk about trading card game design and specifically content creation in regards to trading card games. So that's awesome. And what's happening on May 31st? Hey, there's going to be people here that we have today.
Yes. So the people we have today, minus Scott, plus Natalie Kirshner, who is a colleague of mine from IT, who's a specialist in UX. And so Natalie is going to be kind enough to translate that into a game design context. And Natalie is actually the person who first taught me Catan. So she knows
There you
games
go.
too.
There you
Nice.
go. Awesome. Excellent. Excellent. So we'll see you all here, same time, same place in 7 days. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.